Thank you very much. This is like, I realize this is about the third time in the last 6 weeks I've spoken at Northeastern. And I also look in the audience, I see my department chair is here, so I think he's here checking on me to see if I'm planning to be poached, as Northeastern tends to do, both our deans, our faculty, and other people. So, I try to, oh, I love you, Mass Boston. Even our overheads don't work. And I'm very pleased to accept this opportunity to speak with you after a very long day yesterday and continuing to be a very long day today. And what I want to do is focus a little bit. I'm very grateful for Bill to go first, because I knew exactly what he would do, and he was going to talk about the numbers, which I hoped he would. And he's given us a good overview, really, of what happened yesterday, specifically in terms of recent, at least, American political history. So what I want to do is talk a little bit of what happened as I see it beyond the numbers. Yesterday when I sat down, I did 6 hours of analysis. So when we sit down at my desk, there was exit poll data just sitting there for us to sort of read between breaks. And the first part of it was exit poll data that said overwhelmingly the big issue in this campaign was the economy. Well, I'm going to spend the rest of my talk to say that I think it was more than the economy, stupid. That I do not think that the economy is the best way to understand. It may be a way to understand an election or an election in 2010. But there are greater forces out there that I think we saw unleashed in a very real way in this campaign. And I do not think that they died with Christine O'Donnell or that they share an angle. That I think that these are important forces, broader forces, than American electoral politics that are out there. And so I want to talk a little bit about what I see as some of the shape of those forces that are at play in the American society today. And I think a part of this to look at, and the part that I want to focus on, is the Tea Party offensive. Now, I understand the Tea Party, we're not going to have a big discussion. I think you understand it's a shorthand, understand it, for talking about something that I think is big and important, and that we saw it within this particular campaign. And I frankly think we saw it in a variety of different ways. Look, usually in terms of modern elections, the next day, I'm like many of you, you feel like you should take a shower the next day after sort of watching television. Believe me, I felt like, thankfully my daughter for my birthday got me a pressure washer. Believe me, I felt like I should go through the super shine myself, because I thought that this was an election. And it's critical to my point. There are dirty elections, but what passed for respectable in this election is, I think, reflective of what I'm talking about. What are the pillars of this offensive that I think we saw in this election? Well, some of them are nativism. The attack upon immigrants and the utilization of these attacks upon immigrants was clear throughout this offensive. And that offensive, I think, was reflected time and time again in immigrants being the target so much of this Tea Party offensive. Another element is racism. There are two things that the Tea Party doesn't like, right? One, they don't like being called racist, and the second thing is they don't like black people. Part of this is racism. I don't mean every element of it, but I think there are elements of racism in it. And it reflects the composition of the nation as we understand it. Look, the nation is becoming, for the first time in its history, and rapidly becoming so, a country that is predominantly, the majority of the population are non-white. That is a transformation that I think is important, and I think it helps to understand the moment. And also in terms about what's feeding much of that growth is the immigrant growth within the country. And yet that's also of a different variety than we've understood immigration before. The complexion of it, literally, not only the quantity, but the complexion of it is different than we've experienced before. And that is what I think prompts, in some ways, that response. And among those other pillars is this Islamophobia, the anti-Muslim element that we see in so many campaigns across the country. I don't know if you've seen them, but in ad after ad, respectable campaigns, the way in which that has been used as a target and as a device and as a belief as part of this movement as well. I think, for example, in some way, sort of a small example, an illustration of this in some way, has been in some way the attack upon Obama. If you think, for example, in terms of racism, the way in which the Reverend Wright connection, to utilize that term, was utilized in placing him as consistent with every radical black person who's ever existed in the United States of America, and that is the essential Barack Obama was part of this strategy. But then you moved on after that to the whole birther thing. And the whole birther thing fundamentally reflects this whole nativist notion is this guy really an American? Was he really born here? Isn't he actually a foreigner? And then after you kind of slayed the birther thing, for some people, although Marco Rubio, well, his first speech I'm sure is going to be about the birthing of Barack Obama, then they moved on to this notion, is Barack Obama really a Christian? And isn't he a Muslim? And people say, well, gee, this is just silly stuff. Look, the New York Times did a poll, and about 40% of the American people are uncertain about Obama's claim that he is a Christian. That in some ways this encapsulates these elements. But there are other pillars, I think, to this movement as well. There's an anti-internationalist part of this movement as well. One of the times that I spoke at Northeastern was a wonderful conference that you had in your law school, trying to develop a human rights framework to respond to the immigrant rights agenda within the United States. The idea is how do we have a language that we can assert the rights of immigrants, documented and undocumented, because in some ways the whole regime, the focus of so much of what's occurring is not about immigrant rights in the United States, it's about apartheid dealing with immigrant rights. If you think that's a strong word, apartheid is about creating a system in which you select out a group of people and systematically create laws to deny them their rights. And that's much of the focus of what we're seeing in communities and states, not just Arizona, but copycat efforts throughout the country. And so, Northeastern, to their credit, said, how do we respond to this? What's a framework that we can create? And part of that framework was the idea to appeal to the notion that they're all human beings, which is fundamental to the notion of international human rights. But I will tell you this, while that may make sense to a lot of people, that solution for those people is the enemy to the other side. They recognize every notion when you raise the notion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is the enemy. The Constitution, in their interpretation, is the answer. There are other elements of this as well. There is the embrace of a national security framework, really as in opposition to the possibility of a human rights framework. And look, I understand the moment, indeed more than the moment that we're engaged in. They talk about 9/11 as the critical moment, and it was. But to me, we have to interrogate the use of the national security framework to the extent that it is a real concern or the extent to which it is a cover. And I think to a considerable degree, it's a cover. It's a fig leaf, as we call it, that covers the real goods and the real intention. I understand this. I'm Japanese American. I understand the use of a national security cover in order to pursue another agenda on a group of people. And I think that use of that agenda, not by everybody, but utilizing that particular framework is one in which we should at least interrogate the question, is it a real concern or is it a cover? I don't have to go into all the other elements. It is so profoundly anti-gay. And if, again, you look at the rhetoric, you look at the ideas, you look at the suggestions, and you look at the ads, they reflect these elements as well. And it sickens me to say as a university professor, but it is so profoundly anti-intellectual as well. Indeed, facts are the enemy. Facts and data are the enemy. And in that respect, there is this disdain for facts and data. And they disarm a lot of us who try to respond to the situation with precisely that. In fact, they disarm many of us who want to respond to what we think is occurring. And then finally, as an important pillar, there's this degree of moral certainty, a sense of moral superiority. And it is a source of great strength, I think. Because in some ways it goes beyond what we perceive as the rational. It's sort of the flip side of what I've just talked about. And that is the importance of that. Look, I grew up in Utah. I still have relatives in Utah. I go back and visit Utah, and my sister-in-law is a good example. I sort of talk to her late at night, very late at night. I was going to say after a few drinks, but this is Utah. So after a few Cokes, and which is pretty radical for Utah.
Caffeine-free Coke.
Caffeine-free Coke, exactly. Dr. Pepper, actually, they like a lot there. And she says, you know, you people in the East, you think you're smarter than us out here in the West and in the country. And I said, you know, I sort of had to nod to her and say, yeah. But I said, you people out there in the West and out in the country, you think you're morally superior to us out here in the East. She doesn't nod and say it, but I think in some ways there's a little truth to both of that. That there is in some ways this sort of sense as well that occurs there. That in some ways there is this disdain for us smartasses here on the coast and all of our fancy ideas and facts. And then in some respects there is this notion that they have found the truth. And they have found something bigger than facts, something bigger than that kind of rational discourse. The question, of course, is why is all of this? Now look, the language of the Tea Party is in fact the language of revolution. I know there's a lot of discussion about whether they've hijacked the concept of the Tea Party and Joe Lepore's work and so forth. But it is in fact the language of the Tea Party. Their language, if you listen to it, in fact talks about the country not just being run by people who have bad ideas and should have better policies and should run the economy better. They talk about it as being, quote, occupied. It is the language of the country as being occupied by somebody else. And what you do with occupiers is you remove those occupiers. And who are those occupiers? Well, in some ways you look out at the political landscape after 2008 and now up to 2010. The President of the United States is an African American. Until yesterday, the most powerful person in Congress was a woman. That African President of the United States appoints two people to the Supreme Court, both women. One of them is a Latina woman. We have yays getting married in all places like Massachusetts and other places across the country. Their country has been occupied. And so what is the appeal? Look, all of those people in this room who understand political theory know what the appeal is. It's a fundamentally conservative appeal. And what does conservatism mean? What's at the bedrock of conservatism is the answer to the present and the troubles and the pain and the crisis of the present is to appeal to some idealized past. When things were better, when we didn't have gays making demands, when we didn't have those Chicanos coming into the United States, when we didn't have a country that's 50% non-white. Appealing back to a period of time, that's the traditional, that's the classic definition of the fundamental appeal, the fundamentally conservative appeal. And I think we see that very much in this movement, in these elements. Finally, what is the effect and what is the impact? There's been a discussion about the recent elections that we've had, and I think it's been an accurate one. We've seen this is not little changes that we see here. We see one wave coming in one direction, one wave in another direction, and we saw a big wave hitting yesterday. How do you explain these waves, and are they likely to continue? I think they're likely to continue because I think they cannot be separated from, I think they get explained to a considerable degree, not wholly, by the demographic change that I've talked about. They are partially a response to this terrific change that the country is taking place. And that change creates political instability. It creates swings. It creates responses, and it creates counter-responses. One element of that change, for example, that I looked at, just look at the foreign population within the United States. There's a period of time, looking at Congress, for example, when many of the people, at least older people in this room, understood that, look, the United States Congress was like the Massachusetts legislature. It was always controlled by Democrats. That's the one thing you could be sort of pretty confident of, that the Democrats were going to be in charge of Congress. We might change presidents. And that was a period of time that existed through the 60s and through the 70s. Well, it's interesting. If you go back and look, for example, at the 1970 census, 1970 was the year in the history of the United States when we had the lowest portion of a foreign-born population than we've ever had in our history. In other words, we had the largest percentage, our population was really native-born during that particular period of time. In other words, we did not have some of these forces that I've been talking about at play. Today, the Census Bureau just released a report last week. 12% of the people in the United States today are foreign-born, and more importantly, 11% of their children are children of immigrants. In other words, almost 1 out of 4 Americans now is either an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. That's an astounding transformation that is taking place within the country. And what is the effect on our major parties? Look, I don't know what the effect may be, but it's interesting. If you look at the composition of identifiers with the Democratic and the Republican parties, the two major parties, the racial dynamic is striking. To a considerable degree, we are moving towards a Democratic Party that is essentially, not only, I understand this because the whites are still a large group, but is principally and largely composed of non-whites. And you have a Republican Party that has a small component of it that is made up of non-whites, and a significant component of it made up of white Americans. I don't know whether this is going to continue to move in that particular direction, but to me this is a significant way in which the political system is responding to these factors. Let me end on a point of hope, hard to find. But I do think that there is a part of hope because people are saying, gee, Paul, you know, what does one want to do? Actually, there's a lot of people who don't want to do anything. They're like very pleased with what's transpiring within the country. I think that we can find hope, or at least we can find some answers. And they're in the old way in which we did respond to these forces, through coalitions, through alliances, and for some understanding of our history. I gave a talk the other day on our campus, and a woman in the question and answer period, the first person, she raised her hand and says, Professor Watanabe, I'm afraid about being here in the United States. I'm afraid about walking the streets. I'm a black woman. I'm an immigrant to the United States. She says, what do I do? And I was speaking to a group of African Americans. And I said, and I don't have a lot of advice, I said, one thing to understand is that you're not alone in your experience. There are people in that room who are 80 years old. They have walked that walk. They have felt what that person has felt. And I said, you have to understand, or we have to help you understand, that you are not alone here in 2010 in Boston, an immigrant from Rwanda, feeling that. There is a connection there. You know, one of the big parts of the immigrant rights movement, the thing I admire most, everybody talks about the immigrant agenda, the failure to pass comprehensive immigration reform and so forth. They're not moving in Washington on immigration issues. And people want to say, why aren't they moving? Where are our leaders? Who do we look to? You know where you look to on immigrant issues? You look to students. You look to undocumented students who are fighting and literally putting their life and destiny on the line for things like the DREAM Act. Their life and destiny on the line. And there's a group of students from Massachusetts, the student immigration movement, which is one of the leaders of this. And they want to know how to help organize around the DREAM Act. And you know what they did? They took a bus and they went to Little Rock to talk to the 2 remaining people from the Little Rock 9. Because they said to themselves, maybe to understand what's happening here, we got to go and talk to people who attempted to be the first people to do something that they're trying to do. The first blacks to go to a public school in the United States in Little Rock. That's the way in which you attempt to try to respond. You attempt to build alliances. You attempt to appeal to history. I was talking to a guy named Salvador Reza, who's one of the leaders against Sheriff Arpaio in Phoenix. He's been arrested 30 times. Arpaio throws him into jail just to piss everybody off, and then they get 6,000 letters within an answer and they let him go. And what he said, what we've got to do here is to build a movement that connects Selma to Phoenix. And I think he's right about that. We have got to understand that there's a connection between this. So here's my final point. Where would I get hope and inspiration? Well, I found it on my bedstand over the last week. This is a good question for a debate if you're asking governors these questions. And the book that I'm reading is The Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson's book, about the great migration, the unseen migration, really, of African Americans from the South to the North. And usually you say to yourself, okay, that has nothing to do with the immigrant plight, that blacks and immigrants and some of these new populations don't have anything in common. But I want to sort of paraphrase what she said. I actually have the quotation. But she said, in researching this book, she said there is a thread which ties together the population in this book. It's a thread that ties together why people left in the early 16th century from Europe to come to Plymouth for religious freedom. It's the tie that connects people who left Ireland when the ground did not produce food and they needed a place to go. It's a tie that connects people who left, the Jews who left the excesses and of Nazism and needed a place to go. It's the thing that ties together why a family leaves China or why a family leaves some other country when the ground does not produce what it needs to do for the family to grow. And it's the thing that ties together people in the South, black Americans, who are facing lynching and discrimination and horrid conditions. And you know what all those populations do? They get up and move to a better place. That's what's going to connect, I hope, the people together in response to what I think is an important force that's out there.